So we live in a world with 7 billion people approximately, and of those 7 billion people, approximately 5 billion of those people now have mobile phones. And of those 7 billion people, between 3 to 4 billion are connected, one would say, connected to the internet, connected to the web, so on. So of these people, we have about 3 or so billion people that are connected to the internet, and 5 billion or so that are connected to mobile phones, right? So one would assume that that means that we have equality in the world, right? That means we have world peace, we have the end of poverty, problems in public health have been reduced, basically an equal playing field. The world is flat, as Thomas Friedman points out, that all these kinds of sort of metaphors and prognostications and manifestos have arrived. Clearly we know from this morning that that's not the case in Stockton. Let me tell you that that's not the case globally as well. Instead, the reality is that while being connected, while having technologies can produce powerful consequences for people locally, generally speaking, various forms of inequality that already exist are perpetrated in this digital era. What do I mean by that? Well, you have to have electricity to be able to use a technology. You have to have the infrastructure for that technology to produce positive benefits to you and your family and your community. You have to have the already existing social networks to be able to use that technology to sell goods or to make transactions or to meet new people. So all of these sorts of factors are confounding the digital revolution and the promise of digital equality. So I am a professor at UCLA, and what I look at is ways in which you can work with different communities, diverse communities around the world, and start with community, start with culture, start with people, and then think about technology. So we start with this story here in the remote region of the Alpine Mountains of Kyrgyzstan. So Kyrgyzstan is a landlocked Central Asian country that borders the western border of China. And I'm out here with one of my friends hanging out as a professor with these communities at 13,000, 14,000 feet of altitude. And the previous night, they've asked me to do 20 shots of vodka. Luckily, once you're done with like number 10, you can kind of throw the rest over your shoulder. It's basically an indigenized process at this point. And not only did they ask me to drink all this vodka, they also brought me sheep eyeballs that they wanted me to eat. That I was not so fortunate to throw over my shoulder. What were we doing here? Well, we were starting with community and looking at how technologies such as the video camera that you can see in this image here could actually be used by people locally to create benefit in their own lives. So we start with community, and we see people using video cameras to preserve various practices of agriculture, preserve their language, connect stories between elders and youth. So this idea of the democratization of technology has some promise when it starts with people and community. Yet at the same time, in the capital city of this country, in a city called Bishkek, this was going down, revolution time, people's power time, so to speak. And I noticed at the same time that I was working way out in the country with these video cameras and these amazing people, that there were people using the blogosphere in Kyrgyzstan back in 2005 and 2006, in a country with under 1% internet access, and in a city, maybe 2 or 3% internet access. Why were people using blogs if nobody was connected? And then I realized, I started to study this same question as I was out in the mountains, that people were using these technologies to connect to one another, because if they all met in the same place, they would get assassinated or arrested, hopefully arrested only. And that's very, very interesting as we start to think about issues related to revolutions, this wave of revolutions that's occurring around the world, and the question of what role technologies are playing in powering the people, in introducing the right amount of wrong into global and cultural populations worldwide. And specifically the story of Tahrir Square, Cairo, Egypt, captivating all of our imaginations, I'm sure. Malcolm Gladwell weighs in on this with an article in The New Yorker in 2010 called Small Change, saying, these technologies just make us, we just click on links. It doesn't mean that we're going to go out on the streets like Dr. King. We're not going to socially organize. We're not going to really put our bodies in harm's way. He said it's just a small change. And in fact, it distracts us from the realities of organizing. Well, in Kyrgyzstan, I found out that technologies were not just about spreading petitions or clicking on links. We all get these links with the election coming up right now. But they were actually about building small networks of communities. So I responded to Malcolm Gladwell in a New Yorker letter that I wrote, and then in several columns I wrote for the Washington Post afterward. And I decided I would figure out, when everybody's talking about Tahrir Square and the Arab Spring as being Facebook revolution, Twitter revolution, what's the truth? Well, I've been working in Egypt, in Cairo, for the past 2 years, trying to study the role of technologies in these magical and powerful social movements that we see occurring around us in the world today. And part of what I found out last year in my research was that neighborhoods and institutions and mosques and also beautiful street art and graffiti, like what we see here in this image, are powerful for rallying people, not just uses of technology. But also, we found the following. People coming together in these great moments and protecting one another. This is a very powerful image of a group of Christians holding hands, protecting a group of Muslims who are praying in the middle of the square. So they're protecting the Muslims by holding arms with one another in solidarity across faith to protect from the regime police who were brutalizing these people at this time. And when you go and hang out in the square, or all around the Arab Spring, you see t-shirts like this being sold. So of course I wanted to buy one. Then I put it on and I found out it was half my size. And then I gave it to my friend and it was half his size, and then he gave it to his infant child. And what do these t-shirts say? Well, this is kind of how the informal economy works. People, sell t-shirts, say Google, Twitter, Facebook, tools of freedom. And I was wondering, how could that be the case in Egypt, where 1% of people have Twitter accounts at that time, in 2011, and 5% of people have Facebook accounts? How could that be? Well, these people who are using these technologies are younger, upper middle class, generally speaking, more educated, more technologically literate, all those kinds of things that we would possibly predict when we think about technology users. And the question really is what were the bridges between their world and the fact that millions of people came out and took power last year? So these are the questions I was interested in. And so to try to answer these questions, you can't just start and stop by talking to the same usual suspects, even though they're very interesting, but to also talk to people across classes, across groups, across demographics, across gender, across religion. And part of that search led me to Islamic Cairo. Very beautiful place. I climbed up the top of this building and I saw this shack. And this shack was basically made out of various types of recycled materials. And I was shocked when I walked up to this shack to see electricity, one electricity plug point on the shack connected to a satellite television program. And why is that interesting? Because the guy I see on that satellite TV is an Al Jazeera reporter who I interviewed the previous day, who tells me, Ramesh, I get all my stories and my ideas from Twitter. So this is what we call the media ecology. The idea of newer media and older media converging and colliding. And that creates powerful possibilities of things to move across cultural groups and make bridges between people across different segments of a population. But it's not unproblematic because the authors on Twitter represent a limited demographic. And then it comes to the story of my friend. This is my friend Sharif Abul Hassan. He lives in an area called Mbeba, inner city working Cairo. Very, very tough neighborhood. And I talked to Sharif because he came out to the square and he put his body in harm's way. Believe it or not, this man is in his early 80s. And he tells me, well, the reason I came out to the square was because of the price of tomatoes. And that you don't find on the Twitterverse. People are talking about democracy, human rights, issues of military tribunals, so on and so forth. Much more political issues, right? Like Maslow's hierarchy here. And Sharif tells me also because my son wants to get married and he doesn't have enough money to pay his wife's family for the wedding. So these are very real economic concerns that make a huge difference in people's lives. And when we tell a story that only starts and ends with technology, we only get part of the story and we don't understand why all these people across different groups build bridges to come together to enact social change that changes the world in which we live in, the right amount of wrong. So these are great images here that I took in and around Tahrir Square, and I was working all over Egypt as well over the last 2 years. You'll see each of these images tell a different story. The image on the top right shows a bunch of people on Twitter on their mobile phones during the protest. But these guys are in the back of the protest because when you're in the front of the protest, you're getting tear gassed and having rubber bullets hit at you. And what those guys are talking about, and you see some of those guys on the bottom right, is pretty different than what the guys are talking about on Twitter at the same time. Partly because they're not in the same place, partly because their ideologies and their interests are very different from one another. But what's also powerful is that this is a movement and a revolt that is ongoing, that brings people of different generations together. And you can see this beautiful child on her father's shoulders waving a free Egyptian flag. And one thing you always find, which is increasingly part of the world in which we live today, is that in any revolt, you see people holding video cameras or mobile phones documenting events. And that power of documentation, many say, is what started the Arab Spring. A street vendor in Tunisia setting himself on fire, being burned alive, that was documented by about 100 or so people with mobile phones. Within one day, it's seen by many, many millions all over the world. It's the lead story on CNN and the BBC and so on. So the local becomes the global. And this is something I see that's very interesting that people are engaging with now in Egypt. They are using what is called a tweet up. So what they're doing is all these Twitter activists are meeting together to try to figure out techniques to work it on the street. So this is an example of a tweet up that I went to in central Cairo. And what's interesting is everybody can see the screen behind these guys, and all these other people all over the world are participating in the meeting, even though they're not actually physically at the meeting. So this is an example of how people are bridging between the digital world and the street world, which I think is very important to consider when we try to think about what makes these events possible. Because otherwise we get this. It's what we call an echo chamber. I use my computer so I can look more into a computer, so I can look into another computer, so I can look into another computer. It basically drives us insane. And this is the idea that many people have been freaking out about, saying that the social media world or the digital revolution is just causing us to increasingly navel gaze and not get off of our laptops. People in Cairo call this iPad activism very pejoratively. They say people are chained to their laptops unless they engage in the types of activities like these tweet ups and so on. And then we find what happened very recently with this unfortunate film, The Innocence of Muslims. Now, this is a slide that basically shows the Muslim Brotherhood, which is called the Ikhwan, their Twitter feed. So they run Twitter feeds not just in English, but also in Arabic. Obviously, the English language feed is designed to reach and engage with a different audience than the Arabic language feed. But what happens during the burning and the protests in front of the United States Embassy in Cairo is the Muslim Brotherhood, English language feed people, who are actually based in New York City, are communicating with the State Department people saying, we are relieved that nothing has happened, we hope you guys are okay. But then the US Embassy responds and says, by the way, have you checked out your own Arabic feeds? I hope you know we read those too. So this is the point I'm trying to make about echo chambers. These worlds can be partitioned, and it's about thinking about how they bridge together to try to find truths in a reality, in a situation that we all really want to understand. Because otherwise we got this, right? And this is what some people are very frustrated about when it comes to the Arab Spring today. We got rid of one guy, and then we got some new guys who are basically dominating us again. So how do we work out of that really vicious cycle that is part of reality? My research leads me to uncover that there's a long game and there's a short game, that activists and other people are using technologies and other techniques to change various issue-driven campaigns, but the long game is actually a game of working the people, working the street, doing what the Muslim Brotherhood has done for 80+ years. And it's amazing when I meet folks in the Muslim Brotherhood leadership and various other segments of the society, the first thing they do is hand me their BlackBerries and say, enter your Twitter handle here. So they're all hearing about TEDxSanJoaquin right now. And then I was hanging out, of course, and spending quite a bit of time over the past year to 2 years in the Occupy movement. I went to the Occupy Wall Street site, the Occupy Boston site, and of course the Occupy LA site where I live. And I think this image is very important and very powerful, and it tells the story of how media and technology has impacted our imagination of the world in which we live. There's a direct line drawn from Tunisia to Egypt, and then this circular line, like circumnavigating the world, drawn to LA. And that's really interesting because many people I speak to within these movements, and we'll see what comes of this movement now, say that they were directly influenced by the events of Tahrir Square, including Dr. Cornel West, who I spoke with at Occupy Wall Street. So this is really interesting, that technologies are not just about bringing the local groups together, as in the case of Kyrgyzstan, or potentially navel-gazing in echo chambers, but also sometimes about connecting activists across borders. And folks that I met in the April 6th movement, which is a leading youth-based movement in Cairo and in Egypt, told me they were connecting to Serbian activists many years ago using the internet. And today they're connecting to other activists around the world, for example, in Sudan. So really, what are the stories of how technology is creating this uncanny and fascinating world in which we live? Well, it's not flattening, but what it is doing are some of the following. It's making the local and global highly intertwined because things are being served to us, right? Part of a 24-hour news cycle means something that's very far away seems very close. Part of engaging with the Muslim Brotherhood's feed on Twitter might be feeling like you're engaging with someone in Cairo, but you're actually engaging with someone in New York. This is a really amazing reality of what our world is like today. We have to think across and not within networks, so across the bridges between different communities and different groups, not just within a particular group. And that's really important, right? When I talked about the Twitter group versus the working class groups versus other groups, the Islamist groups, what are the bridges that bring them together? And realize that prices of tomatoes matter too. It's not just the grievances around human rights, but it's the price of tomatoes as well. And it's people putting their bodies out into the street. Remember, the guys in the front lines of these protests are often young males who are very disenfranchised and are putting their bodies in harm's way. And no matter how much I spend time on Twitter, that can't replace putting my body in harm's way. They're complementary, ideally, and in some cases very divergent from one another. And critiquing is different than creating. Thinking you can overturn something is very different than the very painful, difficult, hard process of creating and generating a democracy. That takes even more of the right amount of wrong. So this is an image that I want to end my talk with and just kind of share this with you. We think that the whole world is flat, but this image shows where the internet is on and where the internet is off. And the point I want to make is even places where the internet is on, it's not on in the same way as it is perhaps in Stockton or in Los Angeles. And this is really interesting because we need to think about what's visible in our world and what's invisible, like many of the speakers this morning have spoken about. And we need to think about that with a global consciousness because that's where some bridges begin and other bridges end. And we really need to think about the powerful events that are shaping our world. If we want to get up and act and stand for values and beliefs that we care about, that we cherish, we hold true, we need to understand the amazing dynamics that make our world what it is, the amazing dynamics that are impacting media, technology, and global power today. Thank you very much.